But yeah, if just as a super brief background on the strike program, last year they made purchases, carbon removal purchases from a number of startup companies. The application process was they public publicly published all the applications and everything that was submitted there, and they're again doing the same thing here this year, and the applications close next Sunday. And so yeah, welcome Ryan. I just wanted to turn it over to you and just kick it off with the first question of, from what you're seeing from the people that you're meeting, what's the ideal company look like that's applying to be part of this purchase?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Tito and team. And thanks everyone for joining. I mean, this is really hopefully helpful for you all. To your point on publishing the applications, that's not something we can do alone. Like, we're very grateful that all the projects last year sort of, applied with that understanding and sort of we're supportive of that. And like, we have the same expectation this year. And like, thank you to everyone who applies in that context, because we've heard from a number of researchers that, it's a really valuable addition to sort of transparency and knowledge sharing in the field. And that's all sort of like, thank you for your own work on that. To the question, yeah, I mean, in an ideal project, we've tried to be pretty explicit about our criteria, and they're pretty similar conceptually to last year's criteria. The sort of high level things here are, 1,000+ year permanence, which doesn't necessarily mean mineral or geologic. It could be ocean or sort of well-processed biomass or something like that. But, conceptually, we want something with, 1,000+ year durability and permanence, and low reversal risk. We want things, last year we said sort of storage outside the biosphere, which I think was a little confusing because we are open to sort of biosphere storage, which has that kind of permanence. Sort of reformulation for this year is, storage with minimal or sequestration storage with like very minimal arable land footprint. Like, another way to look at this is, we want projects where the amount of carbon that can be sequestered permanently scales, significantly better than linearly with their arable land use. That's not to say that there isn't sort of meaningful, incredible work being done in forest and soil projects. It's just, there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and that's not where we've chosen to focus. And then sort of finally, to sort of characterize our criteria, we're interested in being the first customer for promising technologies that have the potential to scale up the volume curve and down the cost curve really significantly. So we look for things with like sort of credible techno-economic potential to reach something like half a gigaton a year by 2040, even if they're just, a demo pilot lab rigged today. And, again, feasible potential to get sub $100 a ton by 2040, even if they're, hundreds or thousands of dollars a ton today. So we're going to try to help stimulate these projects down the cost curve and be a demand signal for stuff that's really exciting, but may not be in the market yet. These criteria are all enumerated in our project application. Hopefully that's helpful, but really want to sort of use this time for you all to ask any questions that are most on your mind.
Terrific. Yeah, you answered a bunch of questions already, so that's been really helpful. So obviously we put the call out for this just a couple days ago, but got a flood of questions. Just from reading through it, I kind of saw basically two groups of questions. First is from people that are at an early stage, like you're saying, kind of that lab prototype stage or before. So I want to talk there. And then there's kind of more technical questions from some of the kind of maybe further along companies where they raised a few $100,000 or a few $1 million,
Sure.
and just kind of wondering where they fit in or how they can dial things in. But just to start at that early stage end, can you talk a little bit about, like, can you expand on that, hey, lab prototype level? What's kind of where's there, like, where are the bounds to that in terms of how early is too early in terms of applying for this specific program?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We hope that, so there's like, we looked at TRLs, we looked at like, are there different ways we could sort of like really formally draw this line? We decided not to use those explicitly, but we definitely sort of like spiritually interested in them. I think a way to think about it is like, we want you to have had, it may be the case that some projects apply and we're like, look, like, it's just too early, go to ARPA-E, come back to us next year or something like that. And that would be great. But we want something where there's been at least some physical system, even at a small scale, and like some real measurement taken, not like a pure model. And that system could be really small, and that's fine, but we want sort of, something's been built to sort of look at instead of a pure model. And maybe it's the first commercial scale demo, the first sort of, going from lab to bench, and this bench scale thing is going to sequester, 100 tons at $2,000 a ton, and that would enable us to sort of publish a paper, validate the research, like sort of see the potential from there. Like, the first offtake when you can sort of credibly call yourself ready for commercial sale, even if it's really, really small. So, we imagine, if you come straight out of a government grant program and now you've sort of proven the lab scale tech, you have, a theory paper and like a couple measurements taken on a physical system, and you want to do your sort of in between lab and commercial or sort of first non-tiny scale, we'd love to try to help out there. Because again, we recognize all these solutions might not work, but that a demand signal early on can be really meaningful. And I sort of, put it to you all of like, if Stripe purchasing the first tonnage off of your thing would be meaningful, would enable you to raise other capital, would enable you to grow the team, would enable you to raise debt, or whatever it may be, to sort of see if your project can really get some traction. If a demand signal from us would be helpful, then, plausibly it's the right stage. If you're too early, you're too early. And you're welcome to, come back next cycle. We intend to do this like once or twice a year. Yeah, it really is kind of a project by project basis. In our application, we ask for milestones out to about 2.5 years. Going further than that, we'd be pretty hesitant just because it's really hard to know progress in the meantime. So we don't have like a really hard date on delivery window, but we'd be, I think, hesitant going beyond 2 years. And we'd bias towards sooner for sure. But if there's something where it's really compelling, there's a clear path to, clear sequestration within that window, we're open to it.
Beautiful, that's helpful. If anybody's here that's got questions about that, are they too early? Please throw them in the chat as we go. More on the, just to jump more on the to the kind of mid-stage people, or the people that are, they've got funding, they've got it together. In terms of quantity, one question that came up was, if we're not, for example, with companies making products or making physical materials out of carbon dioxide rather than storing it, how do you think about the quantity requirement for these companies?
In terms of accounting, how many tons should they sort of quote us in terms of their volume, or how do we think about just sort of utilization markets more generally?
Thinking about a company that's making material using carbon dioxide captured from the ambient air, it's the tonnage isn't really high, but the permanence is really good. How do you think about a company that really like might look at the application process right now and say, hey, we're not major tonnage, so I'm not going to apply?
Yeah, so we don't have maybe two things. We have a carbon utilization specific supplement to the application where we try to ask what about this and your use case, the permanence of that use case, alternate use of the feedstocks and so on, to get a little bit of a sense of sort of the carbon removal potential of the thing. But to volume more generally, we don't have a tonnage target. Like, these are not offsets. We're not trying to get carbon neutral with this. This is not to satisfy a net zero claim. It's sort of none of these things. And if it turns out that a small number of tons can be really catalytic to a given project, we're certainly open to that. But again, that's sort of like subject to those other potential to scale concerns. So if it's a physical material that is a really niche use case that may be really expensive per ton, think some nano material or something like that, you can make out of carbon, you can DAC the carbon, you can make it, it's $10,000 a ton because it's really niche material, but the market's pretty small. That's like potentially cool as a business, right? But I think less the kind of thing that we would see having this sort of large sequestration potential. But in utilization markets, to the extent that the thing you're utilizing is permanent, that's definitely potentially interesting for us. We're going to be really careful in the accounting of sort of removal versus avoided emissions and alternate use of feedstocks and all that to like understand how much to really count it as and sort of back out your price from there. But we purchased some carbon cure last year. Specifically, mineral utilization is like probably the shape that will have this kind of permanence. But we're certainly open to things that have that permanence claim.
Awesome. So that's super helpful in terms of understanding kind of the scale that you're looking for. And again, just I think it's always, as much as you say you're flexible and open, I think it's always good to the more you can talk about that. I think it's just from reviewing people's questions, it often seems like you have this very specific idea of what you're looking for, and there's no wiggle room. But I think there's plenty of companies that might be listening to this that I've met plenty who seem like they would actually be good candidates, and they're just like, oh yeah, no, that's not for us.
Yeah, I mean, we try to balance this, right?
That's right.
Because like we don't want people to spend their time applying who it's just like clearly so far out of pieces. They may be doing really meaningful work, just like not our focus, right? Because the application is a commitment, and we want to try to bound it so that people aren't wasting their time on it. But it's also true that like we don't know all of what's out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these sorts of conversations. And we sort of depending on what we see out there is really where our approaches come up.
Yeah. Can you talk a little about last year, like in terms of what was that like last year? Were there companies that applied that were unexpected, or was it kind of a lot of things that you expected to see?
We were surprised by a good handful. Last year, admittedly, was it was our first time doing it, and we didn't have a really hard permanence criteria up front. We sort of wanted to see what was out there and evaluate it with. We actually had forest and soil projects apply, many of whom are doing like quite good work. And the fact that we didn't purchase from them is not a statement about their lack of credibility. It's more that like once we saw everything that was out there, we decided to focus on the permanent stuff because there's just so much less of it, and we want to help stimulate that. So last year we had a wider variety of applications because we had some forest and soil projects apply. And one of the things we were struck by was how few sort of high permanence solutions were even applying. So that's sort of where we thought we could be most useful. To your question on how what was your question on how the reviews worked, or were?
That was my next question, but yeah. Okay. It was mostly just to, again, like for people that are thinking about applying, acknowledging that like just because you haven't talked with them already, like doesn't like that's not.
It is a public application. If we we know that we don't know everything that everyone is working on that has the potential to be interesting. If we were confident we'd seen everything out there, we would just like privately send invites, and it would be way easier, right? So like the point of this being a public application and us making the criteria public is like, if you think you're saying like it's on you in the application to sort of like describe why you're a fit against the criteria that we've again tried to be like quite explicit about. And if you think there's something there, you think it's worth applying, please do. And if you want to email me and sort of get a double check that the thing seems reasonable, happy to do that. But we leave it open enough because we want to be surprised by cool things people are working on that we haven't seen before.
Awesome. Yeah, I just want to make sure that comes through because it's a great program, and you are clearly flexible to stuff that works. That's the criteria, stuff that meets your criteria.
And this falls out of our really high level goal of just like our goal is to accelerate increase the likelihood that the world has the portfolio of solutions needed to like mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And like mitigate the worst effects means like we need those on a timeline, right? We don't need them like arbitrarily far in the future. But it also means that we think about it from a large portfolio perspective. And like there's a lot of great work being done in forests and soils and like some of these nature-based solutions. When we look at, for removal specifically, obviously emissions reduction, top priority, main area. But one of the gaps we've seen in the world's portfolio sort of climate solutions overall is permanent removals that have the potential to get big and the potential to scale. And something that can grow to that is what we're interested in here.
Super helpful. So one question that came up from Simon and as well as from people that wrote in beforehand. Can you talk about the application process, the review process, in the sense that, hey, you're covering so many different topics, so many different. There's all these supplement pieces. What's the review process on your end, so that somebody who's got something that is perfect, it works, but maybe it isn't so well known? Can you talk about your process from that standpoint in terms of reviewing companies?
Yeah, so the way we handle our reviews is we've sort of convened a group of academic experts who we sort of ask to serve as reviewers, and we compensate them for their time, and they will we'll take a first pass on applications to see what sort of seems strong enough that it's worth our experts taking a look at. And then from there, we have experts in oceans, experts in mineralization, experts in DAC, experts in material science, and so on, research in these fields, sort of with their own specialty. This year, also, the application asks about some public acceptability and environmental justice and governance questions of particular concern and interest, probably to like ocean projects with large ocean footprints, and so on. And we have a handful of experts in that area as well. So we ask our experts to sort of rank and describe projects against each of our criteria. And projects who fill out certain supplements will be reviewed by experts, obviously with expertise in that area. And we don't necessarily think this is a perfect review methodology by any means, but it worked relatively well last year. And we think it hopefully does a good job of balancing sort of scientific and technical concerns with, public acceptability and environmental justice concerns, and provides us sort of the best information needed for, we look at the results of those reviews, and then, we make our final purchase decisions. Our experts aren't responsible for those. They inform us throughout the process.
Awesome. With you mentioned the public acceptability and environmental justice. Can you talk more about, in terms of reaching this goal? Can you talk just more about how those criteria fit into this program?
Yeah, I mean, there's like a couple lenses on this, right? Like, at a really high level, if we're serious about a solution scaling to, half a gigaton a year, it needs to address these issues, right? Like somewhere in this life cycle. Otherwise, like it'll have a PR disaster, it'll get blocked, it'll have a significant issue where it's being deployed. Like, it's just like, it's not like a conceptual thing. It's just like practically, like you can't get that big without, correctly addressing stuff. And we recognize that, public engagement around some of these technologies varies really wildly in different countries. And, public perception of things like DAC are significantly different in parts of Europe than they are in America or they are in Canada. And we don't have a specific formula that we mandate projects follow, because it seems like there's still work being done in the academic community to try to figure out what's reasonable there. But we care that projects are thinking about this and taking it seriously, and recognize that like they can't get to scale without addressing these issues along the way. So it's more about, based on your scale, the expectations here are going to be very different, right? Like, if you are only at a lab scale, never deployed anything in the real world, we don't expect that you have had detailed public engagement committee meetings with everyone in the place you're like, theoretically planning to deploy many years from now, right? But if you're close to deployment, like it's a very different story. And that's important not only for us as, the purchaser and, sort of on the hook in that sense for the environmental impacts of these projects, but just like very practically to like actually solve the thing, like we need to figure out how to handle this.
Yeah, well said. I like how that, you're kind of doing the work of thinking about the roadblocks that are ahead for reaching a gigaton scale. Kind of thinking about
one other thing I'll add on this front is, if you don't have a fully thought through answer to some of the public acceptability and environmental justice stuff, like that's okay. One of the things that we've worked on with our experts in those areas, and sort of going back and forth on Google Docs with them a couple of weeks ago about how we formulate some of these questions, but like hopefully we can provide you useful pointers on that anyways, right? It may be the case that like, a project is too early or they don't have some of these things figured out. We say come back next year, but like in the meantime, here's a couple of experts to talk to. Like we assume really across the board, like projects are operating in good faith. In some areas they may not know what to do, but like we assume that they'll respond well to feedback and like, try to get better.
That's really cool. That's nice to hear that you're helping helping companies get there. In addition to the carbon purchase. One thing I wanted to ask about. So clearly you're helping companies think ahead about the bottlenecks and the roadblocks ahead. In terms of looking behind, right? I looked through, there were about 24 or so applications last year. I'd imagine most of the companies that are applying this year, maybe not most, but like I imagine a lot of them might not have existed last year, or they might have been
it's so
one
cool.
person.
Yeah, we have a
right?
lot
Like,
that we'd like maybe heard of or were very new, and now there's some really new ones. I mean, that's why we're doing this continuously, right? Like that's why it's not like we're done after doing it 1 year. Like if there aren't new companies every year, then like the ecosystem not developing, we're not able to push it enough. Like then like it's not working.
Completely agree. Can you talk a bit more about like any gaps that you see in that startup ecosystem, kind of in that free period?
Yeah, in terms of like what are areas that we'd love to see more projects working on, or
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have personal opinions here. Different academics have different personal opinions here. I think that, setting aside the category of things that I've never heard of and that, we've never heard of and that one of you may have sort of recognized and is working on, that, like, awesome. Definitely don't treat this as like, guidelines by any means, but areas we've seen some more activity in recently is sort of fully new sorbents, new process designs, like new DAC, which, is really exciting, but a lot of that's quite early. More work on surface mineralization across the board, beyond coastal enhanced weathering, sort of a variety of different surface mineralization techniques. there have been like some cool papers that have come out in the last year in that area. There's a Peter Kellerman paper on basaltic powder as a soil additive with like meaningful mineral sequestration, which is pretty cool. I haven't seen anyone trying to commercialize that, but like I know there are some groups who are working on sort of lab scale trials of it, which would be really cool to like get some monitoring in place and see if that kind of thing's viable. Again, that would be mineral permanence, not soil carbon. That's one area. So like mineralization, surface mineralization in general. In terms of oceans, we've seen some really interesting work being done in macroalgae and macroalgae sequestration. This is an area we were like, conceptually really interested in previously, but now there seem to be some real companies, very early on looking at some of that work. So that's really exciting. I feel like generally, I imagine there are more interesting ocean projects that exist out there that we haven't seen yet. It seems like there's an area with a lot of potential there. We would love to see some crazy ideas to that front. Yeah, I'd say ocean and mineralization are two that we've been particularly interested in or seen more of. There's also potentially a lot of room in synthetic bio. Again, to get longer than typical biogenic permanence. I mean, there have been some ideas around like bio-enhanced weathering, where like there could be a moss that would like, eat a rock faster and expose more surface area, and therefore give you better energetics for like regular mineral weathering, which is very cool. I could go on, but there's a lot of interesting things out there.
That's neat.
And if you see something that we've never heard of, please send it to us, and hopefully it can make sense.
Awesome. And not only will it just maybe make sense to you, but as these applications are public, that will more people will be able to see that idea and get interested in that.
I saw briefly one question that came into the chat on the basaltic augmentation sort of being a biomass issue. The way we think about this is to the land footprint standpoint. The thing we're most concerned about for land footprint is like making a claim to land where then, because of your carbon claim, that land can't be used for something else without disrupting your carbon claim. And this is not because we don't think that's possible. We think it's certainly difficult. We also just don't want to be in the business like evaluating people's contracts with landowners over like some extended time window. It's just like a very different thing to try to evaluate than like evaluating like the thermodynamics of some process. So specifically in the basaltic soil augmentation case, if someone were to propose that, it's not like net new land, right? If their argument is like, we have this pathway to get it to existing farmers and they want it and they will put it on existing land, that we're not making a claim that they should change their land use or something like that, that I think could be reasonable. This is essentially the perspective we took, with Charm Industrial last year. They use waste biomass, which is sort of, collected from land that grows biomass, but it's sort of not a like, this land is now cordoned off for our biomass specifically and can't be used for other things kind of claim. So that was sort of what we were more comfortable with.
Beautiful. Again, throw any questions in the chat if you've got them. Just one kind of last question, but just again, thinking about that kind of early stage ecosystem, getting companies to the point where they make sense for them to apply. You mentioned ARPA-E. I'm just thinking, and you have this global view, like if you're thinking about the ecosystem that exists to support companies to get to the point where they make, where they're a good applicant, any gaps that you see in terms of funding, in terms of support, whether it's in the United States or globally?
Yes, and so many, and many others are thinking about this sort of as well. One point on RPE, I recognize RPE as a US example. We're really serious about trying to get projects globally. And our networks in Europe might not be as strong, but we're working on that. I just had a conversation with some folks working on an accelerator at ETH Zurich yesterday, trying to find carbon removal projects throughout Europe. We haven't seen a lot of projects in Australia, Japan, the rest of Asia, most of Latin America. We have no bias towards any region. Like we have to pay USD for our own reasons, but like apart from that, like we'd love to see projects apply from anywhere. And to your point on the funding ecosystem, yeah, we recognize it's very different areas, and we're seeing what we can do here to potentially be helpful. I don't know if I have an exact answer for you, but I think there are different bottlenecks in different regions, right? Whether it's a lack of sort of sufficiently technical talent in some area, or a lack of early government funding, or a lack of university research ability, or we see this sort of overall bottleneck that we're trying to solve, this sort of lack of early commercial demand, right? But it's not that everyone's blocked by lack of early commercial demand. They can be blocked by, any number of things on the way to that. So I don't have any specific answers for you on that, but we would love to find a way to sort of make it the case that more projects are blocked on commercial demand specifically instead of some prior thing, so that then we can help with that.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of bottlenecks, and there's a lot of unknowns. One last question I thought was also relevant was just in terms of the whole public application. I'm a fan of it, but if companies aren't, if they feel like, hey, we've raised millions of dollars, our investors don't support us, can you do an NDA? Can you do anything or what do you suggest for these companies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This is something that we have gone back and forth on. I think there are really good arguments on both sides. Frankly, the feedback we got from a number of folks we talked to when we were thinking about putting, a confidential section in the application is like, just to be super honest, like if you give projects a confidential section, they'll put everything in there. And I think that spiritually, like the goal of this public application is to provide transparency for buyers and for the academic communities. It's like, what is actually out there, right? And like, what are people working on and what exists? And if we recognize though, like we may have applicants who are nonprofits, but we don't expect that. We think that there are real businesses to be built here and recognize that companies have IP and trade secrets. And like, we don't want to make your company less valuable if we buy from you. That is like the opposite of our goal. But we also think it's important for there to be a baseline of understanding of what's available. So I think that means like answer the application in a way that you feel comfortable with it being made public. And if that means you have to be fuzzy on details in certain areas or provide a range for certain numbers or, whatever you need to do to feel comfortable with that, like we understand that. And if it means you have to leave some things, entirely blank, obviously we'd prefer if that wasn't the case, but if it's that or don't apply, like, sure. But, at a high level, we expect projects to complete the application at whatever level of detail they're able to, that's made public. And then if we have more detailed business diligence or more detailed technical questions or something, once we do a round of evaluation and we say, these are the project things we want to purchase from, we can reach out to you and have like a private conversation about some of those more specific details and handle it that way. And again,
Beautiful.
This is based on feedback. We may change this throughout the year, but this is, throughout the process, but this is where we're coming from. And hopefully that's helpful context. Like we're not trying to expose your trade secrets to everyone and make you less competitive, right? Like projects being concerned about, competitive info in the application, in some sense, it's like, it means there are potential competitors. That's great, right? That's great for the ecosystem overall. But yeah, no, we're not trying to hurt your business by applying. Be as open as you can in the application. And if we need to talk about it privately, we can.
Awesome. Well, so again, thanks for all the context on this. I think it's really helpful to have you here. I saw you had put your email into the chat somewhere. It disappeared, but if people scroll up, they have questions. Yeah, again, thank you for being here. Good luck reviewing all the applications. Thanks for all that you and the Stripe team do to support this ecosystem. And we'll talk again soon. Maybe we can get together and chat once the finalists are announced.
Awesome. I have like 10 or 15 more minutes if anyone wants to stay on and chat. And yeah, thank you all for coming. This is really helpful. So I'm happy to hang out if people want to stay on. Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, that works. I'm trying to think of how to moderate.
I can keep the recording going. I can keep the recording going too, if that helps.
Yeah, sure.
Well, whatever's helpful for you all.
I got a question.
Sure.
This is Joe James. I'm with a company called Agritech. How are you? And I've been in correspondence with your chief exec a little bit, and I look forward to having a call. But our process is not only great at CO2 capture in a very cost-effective way using very special biocrops, but we can also use the crops simultaneously to clean up brownfield sites, to screen out airborne particulate matter, and to do other things that enhance environmental justice. And I got on the call late, but I heard you indicate that environmental justice was a consideration of the processes that you might purchase. Did I hear you right?
Yes. We don't have a like specific answer we are looking for projects to provide us, but we're looking for projects to like take it seriously, think about it, and be explicit that they have some thoughts, that's an area they recognize may apply to the project to the extent that it does.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. hey, everybody, we've got about 45 people in here, so I'm not sure how to do it orderly, but it's not also like we have a ton of people. So if you do want to unmute and ask a question, if the next person wants to jump in, great. And if after that, you can just hop on chat and say you want to chat next. Yeah.
Tito, can I jump in?
Hey, of course. What's up? We can hear you fine.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'm just off my phone actually. I was just on the road here, but I had a question for Ryan. I guess a two-part question. So one was just to dive a little bit deeper into the comment you made about not that many solutions the last go around that really had permanence. So just kind of curious if you could dig into that a little bit as to what you saw was maybe a concern there, or what were the type of solutions that really stood out from that standpoint. The second question is actually kind of relevant to our team's work at Carbon Upcycling. So we're also a carbon utilization company that's kind of using the mineralization pathway. And our understanding based on the application, we didn't look at the application last year, but we did this year, or have been looking at it. Our understanding is that you're only looking at credits for the removal piece and not credits that be associated with the displacement of a high carbon footprint material, for example, cement. So from that standpoint, I did want to know if you're looking at the perspective of, if there is a mineralization pathway that's creating a commercial product, essentially, I guess the argument that you can make from an economic standpoint would be that, an offset or a credit from Stripe or any other company would essentially be able to move the needle on what is already something that's, within potentially a tolerance margin of what a customer might pay for. And so I'm curious from that standpoint, like if a facility is deployed and it's making X tons of carbon removal and Y tons of carbon derived product a year, there's a portion of that that's already being subsidized in a sense from a carbon removal standpoint by the customer who's buying it for another purpose. And I'm just wondering as to how your thought process around that economic piece, if not the life cycle carbon emission reduction piece, plays into your adjudication of, in this process.
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate you asking it. I don't know if we have a perfect answer to this. And I think that in the utilization case and sort of the subsidy and economics case, it's really tricky to evaluate. And it's really tricky to evaluate against like really strict criteria without trying to get into evaluating alternate uses and evaluating avoided emissions with some just like really tricky additionality questions. So I guess like at a high level, that's why we've like really tried to focus the application on the pure removal as opposed to theoretical avoided emissions. We give you a box to indicate avoided emissions, but like in your sort of like offer to Stripe section, we really ask about actual removal. This isn't to say we don't, at a high level, like for these utilization companies, even if our thesis on it may not be perfect, it does seem reasonable to us that they need to at least be very explicit about like within whatever net removal number, like what is coming from a claim about avoided emissions and what is coming from a claim about, permanent utilization removal. Just because like the mechanism to evaluate each other is just like super different. One is like a counterfactual claim. The other a claim of like, put my material in a spectrometer, look at how much C it is. And like, if it's mineral, then like, cool. So we try to ask projects to break those things out just because they're just like very different claims with very different evaluation mechanisms. As for sort of our philosophy on how we weight each of those, we'd like to really focus on purchase signal removal. And hopefully in your case, not that we don't believe the avoided emissions or anything, like very much far from that, hopefully the market can support those avoided emissions in either traditional credit markets or in the pricing of your product. And sort of there's a way to take credit for those. But again, I think this is really kind of case by case, and this is really tricky to evaluate in utilization businesses. It certainly doesn't disqualify you, but we, for a mix of good reasons and just like practical, because it's really difficult to evaluate the counterfactual reasons, prioritize the actual embodied sort of like emissions or carbon removal. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. I have a couple of follow-up ones, but I think for the most part that it does answer what I was asking for. I'll probably just email you about a couple of clarifying points there, but I think
feel free.
It's good to know at least that, our understanding of the application makes sense. And I do understand the caveat that you put out there. Like, there are already some mechanisms in play to look at the baseline emissions of a certain material. And if you're displacing that, to be able to make a credible life cycle case for emission reductions. But
Yeah.
You've got a very kind of focused lens around the direct removal piece, and that makes sense.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. We've tweaked. This was one area we changed the application pretty significantly from last year based on some of the learnings we saw from projects. So yeah, it still may not be perfect, but that's sort of the approach we're taking.
Hi, I have a question.
Hi,
Sorry.
what's up?
You can go first, Lillian.
Okay, thank
Lillian.
you. Hi, I'm Lillian. I am a MBA student at Stanford. I'm wondering, how do you verify the permanence of sequestration? And are there any forms of sequestration that you would prioritize?
Yeah, so good question. In terms of sequestration, we prioritize, frankly, like sequestration that's easier to verify the fact that it's permanent, which basically means mineral. Right? Like, you know, if you can get something in a mineral form, like it's the thermodynamic ground state of carbon, and you have to get it really hot to, you know, release it. And that is really easier to work with. So, you know, prioritize mineral because it gets you the permanence with sort of less verification over sort of less continuous verification needs. In terms of how we're going to monitor and verify, we ask projects to make claims in the application. And, you know, in one of the questions of the application, we ask projects to describe, you know, in context of their LCA and in context of their permanence, you know, what are some things that an independent third party could come like physically show up and measure about your system to validate this claim that you've made. And we may do that. At a high level, like, you know, this is what our expert review is for, is to look at like the physical properties of their thing and, you know, see if whatever permanence claim is like conceptually physically reasonable, right? You know, is it in the bounds of what you might expect? Is it in the bounds of sort of cited literature for this process? And like, if yes, what could we potentially come measure to sort of validate that like your specific instantiation of this process is, you know, again, in line with the literature and in line with this claims. We don't have a perfect answer to this. I think the ecosystem has a significant gap here, but this is how we're getting started.
Thank you.
I think Alex, you had a question.
Alex Wick here, long-time listener, first-time caller. I'm wondering specifically about forestry rotations. I don't know how familiar you are with the forestry industry, but basically, if you go above and beyond business as usual and grow your trees for longer, they're going to sequester more carbon.
Yeah.
Does that sort of violate that cordoned off thing you're referring to, or?
Yeah. So we've seen extended rotation companies. It's conceptually really interesting, and I can see it being really impactful. We have considered that sort of out of scope for us, both from a permanence and land use standpoint. But that's not to say it's like not meaningful.
Cool. And then biomass as well with forestry. Would that be considered like a charcoal type?
Yeah. So biochar projects, we've had some apply last year. Our concerns with biochar are primarily around, you know, the land use concern, you know, is it made from waste biomass or is it net new land as it applies to sort of all biomass stuff? And what is the physical footprint? What are the competing uses? Just general biomass feedstock questions. But then additionally, around char, obviously the permanence. How's it being pyrolyzed? What's the O2C ratio? How detailed is the characterization of that char and how consistent is it across batches of feedstock? And then, you know, it seems like there's some uncertainty in the field, frankly, around like what level of char has what permanence in what deployment environments. And we sort of, depending on what we see from project, like it seems conceptually possible, although on the high end of the sort of literature that we've seen, that you could have 1,000+ year permanent char. It doesn't seem like definitely physically impossible, but it seems like may not be the default and depends a lot on the chemical composition of the char and wherever you're deploying it. So if, you know, you can make a case that you're going to have that 1,000-year permanence and this sort of meaningful cost curve, you know, potential for scale type of learning curve effect, then it would certainly be in scope. We've just found historically that like it's hard for biochar to sort of like really satisfy both of those things, but we don't rule out the fact that there like could be some that does. Biochar's tricky.
Ryan, I'm sorry. Hey, how's it going? So Quincy Salmon from Carbase, and we're in the mineralization use space. Just two quick questions on LCA. is there a specific model that Stripe looks at when they're looking at the LCA section? I know there's a couple of different calculators and different models going out there. And the second question is, we're using point source emission from a cement plant. So when we start our LCA counts, we want to start our LCA counts on the emissions, or are you looking at the embodied emissions to those emissions, like the transportation that brought that over? Just to clarify those 2 points.
It's tricky. We want this sort of like, this is very much the sort of like boundary condition, hard question genre of thing, right? And like, we don't want to be too prescriptive because we recognize that projects have differences. We want the most, I mean, I feel like I'm going to tell you sort of like the cop-out answer, right? But like, we want the most comprehensive version of your feedstock emissions, because we want sort of, to most conservatively subtract that from whatever net removal, right? And like, we try to keep this open in the application, where we like ask you to document your boundary conditions and describe sort of what's in and out, so that we can sort of from there back out, again, with the opinions of our experts. We have folks who specialize in LCAs and like cited literature, what is reasonable. Like, we can say cradle to graver, we can say cradle to gate, but like, it really just means so many different things per project that like, we found that being more prescriptive isn't actually that helpful. But just like, what we really care about is that like, if you give us a number, maybe more useful answer is like, if you give us a number in your LCA, like, tell us how you got to that number. And like, we may have follow-up questions for you, but like, we want, an expert to look at your LCA and be like, I understand what these numbers are, what they are. And like, maybe I wish this number was smaller, but like, I understand what this project is doing, is sort of the goal.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
I see we might have one more question from Eli, whose internet wasn't working, but who asked about, I guess it's not really a question. Flow through with biochar.
I don't know enough of biochar chemistry in depth to comment on that, but like at a high level, that makes sense. And it's sort of on the biochar project to characterize the biochar and describe how it'll, meet permanence.
Awesome. And that's why we're all here. We're here to figure out how to make this all work and work together to do it. So Ryan, thank you so much for doing this. It was definitely last minute, and I think it's really going to be helpful for teams that are applying, and whether it's this year or next year. So thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And like, it's really great to see so many people working on this stuff. This is really cool. So hopefully we have a chance to review some of your applications, and if not, hopefully we will soon.